Okay, well, it is 2:01 by my clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started and let others filter in as we go. Good afternoon, good morning, and welcome to COSSA Headlines for October. We're thrilled to have you here, and if there are new folks participating who we haven't had before, welcome to you, and to give you a sense of what you'll see over the next hour. We will quickly go over what the sort of latest news and policy developments are related to social and behavioral science over the last month. And then we will jump into our deep dive, which is the reason I'm sure many, if not all of you, are here. And that is to talk with Bill Riley from NIH about a specific report that has been put out over the last couple of months related to basic behavioral and social sciences research. And then we'd like to end with some homework assignments for anyone wishing to stay involved over the coming weeks. So let's dive right in to this month's headlines. So I find it interesting when the social science news and the news you see on your television or in your news feeds on your phone are the same. So no shock, I think, to you that we are operating under a continuing resolution. There's still debate going on about the debt ceiling. There's still much distraction on Capitol Hill related to the president's Build Back Better initiative, infrastructure legislation, lots of really big and tough issues out there right now. What that means for us is that spending for fiscal year 22, which started 14 days ago, is unresolved. So we're operating under a CR until December 3rd, which has implications for federal agencies. They often cannot issue new spending, start new programs until the appropriations are finalized. But we are hopeful that by December 3rd or shortly thereafter, we will have a completed appropriations process. We are also hopeful that we'll start seeing in the coming weeks drafts of the Senate bills, which have not yet been released or considered. So we've seen many of the House appropriations bills over the summer, but have not seen what the Senate is proposing. So hopefully over the coming weeks, we will get those details and have a better look at what we could expect next year. So follow our coverage on our website and in our newsletter as we are putting out full analysis of what we know in all the legislation so far. And of course, as I said, congressional leaders are preoccupied with the president's $3.5 billion Build Back Better plan. Using the reconciliation process, which I won't go into, but essentially what it means is this is funding that would be in addition to fiscal year 22 appropriations and would be available for use over several years. The House has issued its recommendations, which include many provisions and funding for science agencies that we care about. And so I would encourage you to check out our analysis on our website for the reconciliation bill, knowing, of course, that there is interest by some on the Hill to reduce that $3.5 billion number. And so it'll be interesting to see what makes it through the final package and what ends up on the cutting room floor. So stay tuned to that moving target. The House Science Committee has held a couple of really important hearings over the last several weeks. Just last week, they held a hearing that was focused on maintaining the critical balance between securing the research enterprise and openness and international collaboration. This is especially concerning requirements facing foreign scientists who perform research in US institutions. So the whole research security issue that we've been all hearing about for the last couple of years. Committee members on both sides of the aisle acknowledge the risks of illegal research activities, including espionage and so on. But it's a really tough balance, and we want to keep the US as an attractive place to perform research, and of course don't want to send the country down a xenophobic path. So the hearing discussed a lot of different topics, including the role of law enforcement agencies and how you can balance what the mission of a research agency is versus a law enforcement agency. So it was a very interesting hearing. The recording is available on the Science Committee website. I would recommend that you catch that, as was, it covered a lot of important topics that I think we're all grappling with. And then before that, in late September, the Science Committee held a hearing on social media data research. And so this one was about social media platforms, data research, specifically on misinformation and the spread of misinformation. Members of the committee were all very concerned about the role of social media algorithms in spreading misinformation, and shared their support for increasing access for researchers to study social media platforms. Facebook was specifically singled out by witnesses as a prime example of the so-called black box social media platform that hinders research from being conducted, as many of us in this community already know. The testimony and a recording of that hearing is also available on the Science Committee's website. Turning to the executive branch, just days after members were named to the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, or PCAST, it held its first meeting on September 28th and 29th. PCAST is a committee, an advisory committee of eminent scientists from academia, from the public sector, the private sector, all advising the president on his science agenda. And it's sort of the highest level science advisory committee in the country. This first meeting was pretty general, and it covered two broad themes: strengthening US technology and science and technology, and maintaining our global leadership. And second, the state of US preparedness and public health as revealed by the COVID pandemic. So this whole second day was committed to the pandemic, lessons learned, and how to prepare for future events. Both PCAST members and presenters alike emphasized the need for research in the social and behavioral sciences, specifically to better shape how we respond to future public health crises. So if you only watch the recording, I would check out the second day, where our sciences were called out quite often, which is a wonderful departure from PCASTs that we've seen in the past, not just in the last administration, but really over the course of PCAST being an advisory body. There's been very little social and behavioral science reflected, represented, and discussed. So this was a really important meeting. There is another meeting next week, October 18th and 19th, and this one will focus on climate change, energy, and the environment. And it will be live webcast on the PCAST website. Okay, hopefully you've seen that the White House has reopened the vacancy announcement for the Chief Statistician of the United States. It's still a vacant position, but very, very important. The post has been vacant since the retirement of former Chief Statistician Nancy Potok at the end of 2019. The Chief Statistician oversees the Office of Management and Budget Statistical Policy and Science Branch, and is responsible for implementing cross-agency data and statistics policies, including the Federal Data Strategy and implementation of the Foundations of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, or the Evidence Act. Both of those things we've talked about in detail in previous webinars. So the window for applications, it has been extended, is now open until November 4th. So we really do need this position populated in order to get some leadership in that office. And so if you know folks, or if you're interested, please share that opportunity. There are some pretty important advisory committee opportunities coming up that I really do hope that you will consider and share with your own communities. One is the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee. This is a new entity that was established through the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Act of 2020. This bill created the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative to coordinate AI research and policy across the federal government, and a national network of AI research institutes. And it provided for the establishment of this advisory committee to help inform those efforts. Committee members should represent quote, broad and interdisciplinary expertise and perspectives, and include social and behavioral science with, that's my dog, with particular expertise related to science and technology research, development, ethics, standards, education, technology transfer, commercial applications, security, and economic competitiveness, all related to AI. The COSSA leadership had a meeting with OSTP last month, and this committee in particular was raised as a particular important opportunity for social and behavioral science, stating that this committee is going to be a big deal and its work is going to be very influential. So we really do hope that you will submit your nominations by October 25th. You should have heard that the director of NIH, Francis Collins, has announced that he will step down from his position at the end of the year after 15 years of service as the NIH director, having served 3 different presidential administrations. He's not going too far though. He says that he will return to his lab at the National Human Genome Research Institute. But this is a really big shift. And so the research community will have some work to do to, especially the social behavioral science community, to get to know whoever the new director is. And so we will certainly report as we start hearing nomination rumors of who we might see in that position. There's 2 really important National Academies opportunities coming up that I hope you'll also consider. One is an interdisciplinary study committee to review the literature on bias and systemic racism in STEM workplaces, approaches to increase racial and ethnic diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM, and to offer policies and best practices for anti-racism and DEI initiatives. This has been a recommendation by lots of groups, including COSSA, members of Congress, for the National Academies to do a deep dive into DEI issues related to the STEM enterprise. So this is a very welcome development. The turnaround is pretty quick. Nominations are sought by October 20th. So if you haven't seen this yet, I encourage you to go to the National Academies website and consider submitting a nomination. Similarly, just announced this week, I think, is a National Academies committee on the study, to study the application of insights from behavioral economics to public policy objectives, such as public health, economic well-being, and climate change. This committee is aiming to understand how controversies arise in the field of behavioral economics regarding intersections with other social behavioral sciences. The committee members will be selected from experts in fields such as behavioral economics, psychology, medicine, cognitive science, and methodology. And this one is a pretty quick turnaround, although it was just announced nominations are sought by October 25th. And finally, the latest Why Social Science post from COSSA comes from a group of anthropologists on behalf of the Communivax Coalition, which is an alliance of social scientists, public health experts, and community advocates working to strengthen COVID-19 vaccination efforts in the US, particularly in communities of color. So go to whysocialscience.com to check out that latest piece, and that's also where you can subscribe. Okay, seeing no questions in the chat, but certainly if anything pops to mind, put it in the chat. We can capture it later on in the discussion. But I think we should move on to our deep dive discussion. And I'm really thrilled to welcome Dr. Bill Riley to be with us again for COSSA Headlines. He is the Associate Director for Behavioral and Social Sciences Research and Director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at NIH. And he's been there in his current position since 2015. He has been part of NIH though since 2005, working in NIMH and NHLBI and NCI, and has recently announced that he will be retiring. And we're very happy for him, but very sad for us. He has been asked to come talk with us about opportunities in the basic behavioral and social sciences at NIH. And this is a report that's come out a couple of months ago, but I think it's really important as it identifies very specific research gaps in research areas. And as we have a new administration still trying to get its legs under it as it relates to its science agenda, I think having a report like this is incredibly important. So Bill, I welcome you to join the conversation. And then if folks have questions at the end, you can put them in the chat or we can unmute your line. Bill?
Great, thank you, Wendy. Thanks so much. And just a word of thanks to COSSA, who's been a tireless advocate for social and behavioral sciences, and also just a wonderful support for OBSSR and for me personally as well. So many thanks for all of that. And for all of you who wonder about the happy coincidence of both Francis and me retiring from our positions at about the same time, no, I didn't have a heads up that Francis was retiring when I announced my retirement. And definitely no, Francis didn't decide after I retired that he couldn't go on without me and he needed to retire. Neither of those rumors are true. But I will say that Francis has been just a great support and leader of the NIH and supporter of the social and behavioral sciences there for many, many years. And he's been a good partner with our office and with me over those years trying to advance this work. And I'll just remind people as we make this transition that back in the day when Francis took this job, there were folks within the social and behavioral science community that went, you know, oh my God, a geneticist, they won't understand their sciences. Francis has been a quick study and picked them up very quickly. And I'm sure the same will be true of anybody who comes on after. So Wendy asked me to talk about a recent Council of Councils report that was done on basic behavioral and social sciences research. So I want to try to give you a sense of what we did and why we did it and some of the things that are coming down the pike as a result of that. So next slide. There we go. So you may ask yourself, first of all, why we even did this. Some of you may have been around long enough to know that the last time we did a report on the basic behavioral and social sciences at a NIH leadership level was back in 2004. It was the advisory committee to director report. So a lot has changed since that time. And I'll show you in a minute, the basic behavioral and social science research portfolio at the NIH has increased, particularly as it relates to neuroscience, but in other areas as well. And the sense that we were having was difficulty in prioritizing among the many trans NIH sort of basic behavioral and social science research areas, which ones were most in need of acceleration and needed more traction, et cetera. So we wanted a little bit of help with sort of thinking through where should we sort of move forward with this. And while the IC Institute and Center specific support has increased, the trans NIH basic behavioral and social science research efforts have been limited. Most of you know that OpNet for the first 4 years of its existence as an entity had a tap and money flowing in from various sources. And then once that 5-year period was over, it became basically a voluntary tin cupping of funding to keep it going. So we also wanted to take a look at that and how do we support trans NIH research and whether we need to do a rethink of OpNet. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So next slide. So let's see, there we go. So the charge to the basic behavioral and social science working group of the Council of Councils was to identify promising emerging areas of basic behavioral and social science research that are priorities for the NIH to support. Now, keep in mind that the NIH doesn't support all basic social and behavioral science research, right? It needs to have a plausible translational pathway to a health relevant applied research area. That doesn't mean it has to be translational, but there has to be some argument that the work that's going on is consistent with the NIH's health mission and that it's not supported under the mission of another funding agency. And then of those areas, which of them are not adequately supported by the current NIH portfolio? And then how do we go about sort of addressing that, sort of the nuts and bolts of what sort of things that the NIH need to do differently in order to be able to better support this research. So next slide. These are the working group members, so you just have a sense of who was involved. A pretty broad and diverse group of people, some of which you'll recognize as being editors of some of the major journals in the social and behavioral sciences. And so I think we had a really good team of people who all contributed greatly over the course of about a year. And then many thanks to Bill Elwood, who's also been coordinating our OpNet efforts for over a decade, was one of the advisors on it. One of our newer staff, Kristen Brethel Horowitz, also serves as an advisor. And then Katie Morris, who's been with us for a number of years at OBSSR, was the delegated federal authority or officer in charge of making sure that all the things went as they were supposed to go. So next slide. This may surprise people. If you look at the basic behavioral and social science research investment by fiscal year over the course of time, we have essentially from 2014 to 2019 doubled the actual amount of funding in that area. Now, keep in mind, and this is always the caveat with the research and diagnostic criteria of the NIH, is that we multi-count, right? A grant can be a basic behavioral and social science research and count toward that. It can also count toward a neuroscience project and count toward an epigenetics project, right? So we're multi-counting in any way in which a grant fits within a category. And so there are multiple categories that any given grant fits in. So you have to kind of keep that in mind, and that some of what we're counting, you might go, well, that really has a little basic behavioral and social science research in it, but it's really mostly something else. And that's certainly fine. So keep in mind that if you were just looking for the prototypic standard sort of basic behavioral and social science research project, these numbers would probably be lower. But the consistency of the increase over time, I think, is important to note. Next slide. And then you can kind of look at this by institutes and centers, NIMH, NICHD, NIDA, NIAAA, sort of being the big four in terms of the amount of basic behavioral and social science research that they support. But as you can see, almost all the other institutes and centers support at least a little bit of this work. Now, related to the point that I've just made before, some of the increase in the basic behavioral and social science research portfolio at the NIH has been a result of the increase in neuroscience related basic behavioral and social science research. So 62% of what we code as basic behavioral and social science research is also coded as being neuroscience research. And the increase in things like in the Brain Initiative and the Alzheimer's research and Alzheimer's related diseases research efforts have been part of the reason for the increase that we see in this over the course of time. And the reverse is not true, which I think is surprising to some of my cognitive and behavioral neuroscience colleagues. Only 15% of what we code as neuroscience actually also is coded as basic behavioral and social science research. Because there's a lot of work that happens at the molecular and cellular brain structure, brain circuitry levels where there is no input or output that is behavioral or social in nature. So just keep in mind that distinction as you look at this. But it is true that the pretty sizable amount of what we fund at the NIH in terms of basic behavioral and social science research is also neuroscience oriented. Next slide. This gives you, I think, a better sense of that. This was some natural language processing clustering that was done of our portfolio in basic behavioral and social sciences research. And you can kind of see where the heat map from green to red is sort of the total costs in millions. The size of this circle is the number of wards that are in those areas. And you can see some of the big ones are, again, related to what I just said: functional neuroanatomy, cognition and learning, neurobiology, behavior. And if you look at this, most of the left side of this grouping is more the lab-based types of basic research. And on the right side is more the field-based sort of stuff: child development, health disparities, community and population influences, health services research, and that sort of thing. But you get a pretty good sense of how the basic behavioral and social science research portfolio at NIH is sort of distributed across all these various areas. Next slide. And the award rates differ by those topic areas. If you're doing community and population influences, health services research, you're actually doing pretty well. The eventual award rate for applications that come in there is somewhere around 20%. On the other hand, if you're doing research in sexual risk behaviors and sexual and gender minority health, or neuroimmunology, or pain perception and modulation, your award rates are substantially lower than that. So there's almost a twofold difference between doubling essentially of award rate at one end of the spectrum versus the other. And so one of the things we're looking at a little more closely now is what's the reason for those sort of differences in award rates? Is it really sort of a difference in the quality of the research and what can be controlled for, et cetera, or is it just differences in the way people sort of perceive that science and how it gets awarded? So we're looking into that a little bit more, but there are some differences there that are important to note. All right, next slide. So the working group came up with 8 areas that they considered to be promising and emerging areas of basic behavioral and social science research that were probably not adequately supported by the NIH currently and needed to have a little bit more attention. And I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail. So just a quick glance and I'll take you from here. So the next slide is on some of the behavioral, cognitive, and social neuroscience space. And again, you know, like we said before, a fair amount of our basic portfolio in behavioral and social sciences also has a neuroscience bent to it. So this is going to be a fairly selective process for us in terms of the things that need to be focused on. But the working group 1 talked about more work on sort of event representation, both in perception and learning and memory and other areas. Understudy brain regions, for instance, there's been some really nice research in the last few years about how the cerebellum does a lot more for us than just maintain our balance. And there's a lot of sort of social and behavioral phenomena that are related to cerebellar influences. And then the integration of brain and periphery processes. And this is particularly important for things like neuroimmunology and inflammatory processes, pain perception and modulation. So those are some of the areas that they identified where a little bit stronger behavioral and cognitive and social neuroscience effort would be useful. Okay, and then next slide. Epigenetics was another area where there was clearly a need. It was actually one of the smaller areas and one of the smaller clusters in terms of topics, but it's actually one of the more influential when we looked at what were the citation rates of grants and their publications from various areas and topic areas. It ended up being one of the more influential areas and more of the more highly cited areas in the field. We've done a small trans-NIH effort via OpNet in this area, but we're thinking we're going to have to do a substantially larger piece of effort in this area in terms of epigenetics, and especially studies like the one that's on the right by Rubin and others, looking at some of the social factors that drive DNA methylation and other types of factors that are related to epigenetics. So we'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail. Next slide. I've already sort of mentioned the sleep and sex, which are basic human and animal functions, are functions that we have not spent as much time supporting and researching as I think the field would like, and that's probably quite reasonable. They represent a relatively small proportion of our current portfolio. The home for them is a bit tricky, right? The National Center for Sleep Disorders, which is at NHLBI, sort of represents sort of the sleep disorders end of the spectrum. And more recently established Sexual and Gender Minority Health Office at least sort of addresses some of the sexual and gender minority health efforts. And of course, AIDS research and HIV has had a long effort in terms of sexual activity as it relates to prevention of HIV. But just the basic functions of sleep and sex, we haven't really done that much research on. And it's a key research gap that we're going to have to find a way to sort of encourage more research in that area and fund more research in that area. So next slide. I don't need to even tell you, given what we've been through in the last 2 years, that we were caught with our pants down in terms of what we knew about basic social and behavioral processes related to infectious diseases. We knew some, but we didn't know anywhere near enough to deal with a pandemic of this scope and size. And there's a lot of work that's currently being done during the pandemic that have been supported by the NIH and by others that will help with that. But there's a clear need for us to look at this from a number of areas, from adherence to public health recommendations, risk communication, persuasion, how to do decision-making and uncertainty. There's a lot of basic research areas that are related to infectious disease mitigation and control, where we could do a lot more that goes just beyond COVID to, heaven forbid, future pandemics like this, or flu and measles and other types of infectious diseases. So It needs to be an area that we focus greater attention to. Next slide. Social interactions and influences on health. I think one of the things that's been clear, if you look at our portfolio, is we tend to focus on individuals and how individuals function, probably less so on how they function within social contexts and social units. And so an increase in focus and function in this area is one we've like to pay a lot more attention to. We recently, as part of OpNet, released a FOA on the influence of social connectedness and social isolation on health. Another one that we're, I think is out the door now, or soon to be out the door, on dyadic influences. But one of the things that we're going to do is try to keep the push up for these higher level sort of influences on health beyond the level of the individual. And this is certainly one of those areas we're going to need to pay a little more attention to. Next slide. Maintaining behavior change has come up before, and we've had some prior work that's been in this area for some time. But obviously there are some things that are different about the mechanisms that initiate behavior change versus the mechanisms that maintain them over time. And we've got to be able to have a better answer for maintaining behavior change than to just say, just keep doing what we did in initiation and keep doing it for longer. And so we've got to get a better understanding of what the mechanisms are on even things. This is a nice study by O'Hare and others in their lab about the shifting that happens between goal-directed and habitual learning, which in some ways is part of the maintenance process, right? We begin often with goal-directed type of behavior change. We eventually want to make that a habitual learning process, so it kind of goes on in a more automated way without so much effort on the part of the individual to keep it up. We've done some work in this area and it's encouraged research in this area, but there's obviously more that we need to do here. Next slide. Positive health processes is one of the things that the work group was particularly interested in, and it's of course is a common complaint of the NIH, is that we focus on diseases and disorders and not enough on the wellness end of the spectrum. And I think this is just sort of consistent with that thinking, and even with basic processes that support improved health and well-being, thriving under difficult conditions, all those sorts of things that we could do a little bit more on. And I'll just point you, if you're not aware of it, Robert Wood Johnson put out a paper, I forget how far back in time, but Marty Seligman and others did on positive health and health assets, and ways we can think a little bit more about these positive health processes and understand them a little bit more and their applicability, not only to disease and disorders, but health, wellness, and more positive sort of health and living. Next slide. And then the last area was in the science of science, or what some people call meta science, that there are a number of behavioral and social basic principles that are applicable to a range of things that we do, whether it has to do with recruitment and retention of participants, or encouraging people in open science, and registering and reporting their results, and making their data more open and available, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the points that Wendy made from the House Committee on Science, having to look at sort of research trust and integrity versus being open with their data. But there's a lot of basic research in things like altruism and trust and persuasion and reinforcement. Behavioral economics plays a role here. And just the basic, I think one of the things that we've sort of seen, particularly in the pandemic, sort of highlighted is how few people even understand the whole concept of counterfactual thinking, that if you believe something, that if you're going to take a scientific approach to it, you begin with the opposite of what you believe until you're proved otherwise. And what almost everybody else in the world does is they have a prior belief, and they just selectively, of course, with selective bias, just feed in the information that's consistent with what they already believe, which has caused some of the problems that we have already in terms of the way people think and how they sort of divide up into tribes and that sort of thing. So even just some basic understanding of how to sort of encourage that kind of counterfactual thinking is an important component of this as well, just for the sort of the digestion of all the science that the NIH produces. Next slide. So just in terms of how to implement those areas and some of the other things in the report, we put together a behavioral, most of you who do know, there's a behavioral and social science research working group at the NIH, or basic coordinating committee. It's a coordinating committee that's led by OBSSR, but representation from all the institutes and centers. And in our open sessions, COSSA and other professional organizations also come in and contribute to it as well. So we create a working group from that coordinating committee led by Liz Nelson at NIA, Roz King at NICHD, and Sherry Weeks at NEI. And they'll be reviewing the recommendations along with their working group and reviewing them in detail, and will produce guidance for us and the NIH on how to most effectively implement a lot of the recommendations. So their work's in progress, and we already have some ideas and already moving forward, but we'll have a clear sort of set of guidances from that group in early 2022 about ways that we can actually implement the recommendations of this working group from the Council of Councils. So next slide. So I want to spend a little time on the third question that we asked the working group, which is how to deal with these things, right? How can we these inadequately addressed emerging areas or research be addressed? It should be done by individual ICs or by a trans-NIH effort, and if so, which should that trans-NIH effort look like? So next slide. There were 4 key sort of general areas that the working group focused on. One was on increasing workforce diversity, which has been a significant concern of the NIH for a number of years, and particularly the last couple of years. You know, there's been the work of the Unite group at the NIH looking at a number of ways that we can address health equities but also sort of workforce diversity and those sorts of things, both at the NIH and among the people that we fund. For a number of years, we've sort of thought in the behavioral and social sciences that, well, you know, we're at least better than the general biomedical fields, and certainly engineering and computer science and some other areas. You know, we have a fairly strong diversity when it comes to gender, though probably some weaknesses when it comes to leadership levels in terms of gender that need to be addressed. We have the typical early stage investigator issues and needs, but that's been improving over the course of time. And we've had some improvements in racial and ethnic diversity, but some of the data that we generated from this working group were shocking to me. So if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, there's, you know, the same topic areas I showed you before, and the percent of awards that went to African American or Black applicants in the last 10 years, I guess. And as you can see, there is some workforce diversity when it comes to more of the social science field-based sort of oriented work, child development, health disparities, community and population influences, health services research, et cetera. Where you don't see that diversity is on the more lab-based work in the basic behavioral and social sciences research. So across the board, we have to increase our workforce diversity. We particularly need to pay attention to it where it comes to some of the things on the left side of this graphic to do that work. Next slide. There's also just a general need to strengthen workforce capacity and training. There are 4 points that were made in the working group report. One was on increasing data science capabilities, which I think we're all aware of. And OBSSR a couple years ago, I think now, put together a T32 training program that integrates data science and social and behavioral sciences so that we can begin to develop a cadre of early stage investigators that really have the data science chops to take us to the next level in terms of the type of statistical and computational modeling and AI and ML types of approaches that need to be done to handle that, as well as just corralling their increasing amounts of administrative data sets available to us to do that work. Building capacity for assessing small populations with sufficient power. You know, some of the work that we do are with relatively small groups of individuals in terms of the type of groups where, especially where that's rare diseases, but also some special sort of subpopulations of individuals that are relatively small in terms of overall size. And how do we do that kind of work with sufficient power to be able to get something out of it? There's still a concern about understanding causal inference, and particularly doing that beyond the randomized controlled trial. I think there's sort of just continued misperception that if you don't do an RCT, you can't say anything about causal inference. If that were true, we would never have been able to say that smoking causes lung cancer, right? So there's a lot of work that we can do in this space that will allow us to do a better job of understanding causal inference. And then the T32 issue, which I've mentioned before, we actually don't fund very many predoctoral and postdoctoral training awards in the basic behavioral and social sciences. And so we're currently have a contract that just awarded last month that's going to study all of the behavioral and social research training awards, T's and F's and K's, and identify areas of need in terms of places that we need to expand that and increase it moving forward. So next slide. Okay. Some work on fostering team science and transdisciplinary integration, both strengthening the incorporation of basic behavioral and social sciences within neuroscience. As I said, the other side of that flipped coin is that only 15% of neuroscience is also basic behavioral and social science research in nature. That probably needs to be expanded, and there's some things that we'll try to do there with the Brain Initiative, with NIA's Alzheimer's research efforts, and various other things to do that. Expanded role of basic research within genetics research. We think this is a lost opportunity. There's a lot of large sample, large scale genetics research that for just a little bit more effort to assess some key social and behavioral phenomena, we could do much better work on gene and environment interactions, epigenetic efforts, and those sort of things. And then greater integration of animal models and human subjects research, and then greater support for interdisciplinary research and team science. I will mention there is another Council of Councils working group coming down the pike. It was directed by Congress and the authorization for funding in FY21. And the report will come out in sometime in FY22 that will look at greater integration of social and behavioral sciences into the overall NIH research enterprise. And we'll be able to look a little bit more carefully at how do we get, it's better words than this, but how do we infiltrate some of the more biomedically oriented research that's large scale at the NIH to incorporate more social and behavioral sciences within it. Next slide. And then, strengthening the research infrastructure and the processes. There were some really good points that were made in this section of the report about encouraging more multi-level research, which we've been trying to do for a number of years, but need to find ways to sort of increase that even more. That strengthening the basic to applied translational integration has been a key scientific priority of our office for the last 5 or 6 years, and we'll continue to work on that and find some new ways to do that. Accelerating advances in epi and in population health approaches. There have been some really nice work in those areas, and I think we just need to try to accelerate some of that work to move us into sort of the newer approaches and newer paradigms in population health. And then greater support for large basic behavioral and social science research data repositories and resources. And then the final one I want to spend just a minute on before I stop and answer questions is on strengthening the trans-NIH initiatives in coordination with ICs and with the NSF. So next slide. So we had some discussions about OpNet and sort of how we sort of think about a trans-NIH initiative like OpNet moving forward. As you know, OpNet's been around for 12 years now. It's been around for a while. And as I said, it's really done a lot. And I think most of the people at the NIH sort of are clear and aware that it's done a lot of things and made a lot of accomplishments and done a number of things to sort of spear the basic behavioral and social sciences at the NIH, and also bring in people who previously were not NIH grantees into the space. So we now have more basic behavioral and social scientists who get funded by the NIH than we did previously. So it's done a number of important things over the last 12 years, but it was time to sort of rethink how do we sort of make this a better, stronger trans-NIH effort to support the basic behavioral and social sciences in the places where one institute or center is not likely to support the work. And just to give you an example, the social interaction, social isolation, social connectedness FOA that we put out from OpNet is a really good example of that, because those social influences impact across multiple organ systems, multiple institute and center interests. And so doing that work in a collaborative way across the institutes and centers is probably the best way to do that sort of work. So the steering committee of OpNet met, came up with some recommendations that we floated to the NIH leadership, to Francis and others, and they came back with an approval for basically a reconstitution of the OpNet steering committee as a more trans-NIH basic behavioral and social science research executive committee. that consists of institute, center, and office directors or their leadership level delegates. And so one of the things we're trying to do here is elevate sort of who's in the room making these decisions about basic behavioral and social science research. And they're people who actually control the purse strings to a certain degree. So they're more able to sort of go, yes, this is an important area for us to fund, and we should actually commit funds to doing that work. So that's part of the thinking here about doing that. I guess I showed you before, there are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 kind of high basic behavioral and social science research ICs in terms of the amount of funding that they do in this area. So they'll probably be the leaders of this renewed effort, but there'll probably be other institutes and centers that will be involved as well. And then we'll have that new NIH Executive Committee, which we haven't come up with a name for yet, generate trans NIH behavioral and social science, basic behavioral and social science research initiatives via member funding commitments and what they're willing to sort of put into the effort. There was also a pretty lively discussion in this process about pooled funding for things that were clearly sort of so trans NIH in nature, like training in this research area, research resource and infrastructure needs, that we could pool funding together and make a decision collaboratively on those efforts. And the other thing that came up from the working group was a closer association and work with the National Science Foundation's SBE group or division on shared interests and complementary interests and research gaps that might be the case as we look at sort of what the social behavioral and economic sciences that the NSF are supporting, and then what the NIH is supporting in the basic behavioral and social science research area. So that's all the efforts sort of going on right now. We're in the process of reconstituting, and probably by the end of this year, we'll be standing up this sort of new trans NIH basic behavioral and social science research effort and getting it off the ground, and then sort of transitioning from OpNet to this as we move forward. So I think that's the last of my slides. Yes. So Wendy, I think we can open up for questions, comments, thoughts people have.
Thank you so much. All right, so I will ask folks to either raise their emoji hand or a question into the chat. I had one before I turn to you, Ed. About the research gap areas identified in the report, I'm curious, what has there been a significant response or reaction from the community, or from within NIH? And by reaction, I mean surprise. Was it surprising that these are areas of less support? Are these long sort of held, unstated?
Yeah. You know, I think some of them, Wendy, people, if you know, when we kind of put out the report and got sort of input from the institutes and centers, some of them were not surprising, and they were also highly endorsed by the institutes and centers as well. Behavioral maintenance is one example, right? People have known for a number of years, we need to do something there. Let's stop talking about it. Let's do something, right? And we've done some things in that area. So it's not like we haven't seen that as a gap in the past, but we clearly need to do more. Other areas were a little surprising to people, right? So, you know, we need to do more basic research on sex. You know, you can kind of get the sense of where people go, really, do we need to? Is that the sort of thing that we really want to wave a flag at the NIH that we're doing that research, given the political issues that are going on? But the other side of that is that, you know, we've dived into firearms research prevention. We've dived into a number of structural racism, and we've dived into other areas where there may be some political sensitivities. So I think most people kind of get that we can do it here too. It's not that big of an issue.
Thank you. Ed, go ahead.
Thanks, Bill. This is Ed Lebo. Hey. Those of you who don't know me, I happen to serve as the COSSA board chair at the moment, and I wanted to convey our board's deep gratitude and warm appreciation for your powerful allyship over the last several years. You've helped us navigate through clinical trials and the common rule and the ups and downs of budget wars over all these years, and we're incredibly grateful for the way that you've helped to advance the behavioral and social sciences within the Institute. And you're mentioning infiltration makes me wonder if you have any words of wisdom. This executive committee is and its reformation is an exciting development, but I wonder if there is another level at the sort of technical project officer program level where infiltrating with more social and behavioral scientists can also help us build a cadre of champions who are able to advocate more effectively for this true integration, not the sort of afterthought that behavioral and social sciences can lead to, whether it's in population health or epigenetics or the science of science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So first, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think you're right. I mean, one of the things that I think has been pretty clear for the next working group report that's coming out is that we just need to be on the ground floor earlier, right? That they can't wait till the 11th hour and go, oh yeah, this might be, something that the social and behavioral sciences might have a role in. And that does still happen at the NIH, to be honest, right? I mean, it's getting better. I mean, I just will say the two key things that have happened in the last couple of years, the structural racism issue, which there's no way you can do this work without, incorporating, the social and behavioral sciences into that thinking, has, I think, been one of the ways in which people sort of recognize that, we need to be at the table early and often. I still think, like one of the roles that I had in that space often was to go, there's only about a half a century worth of research on structural and systemic racism, and maybe we should pull from that before we start thinking about how we're going to try to address it. So there's still that, right? And I think a lot of times people in these situations think, oh, it's just common sense, right? And we have to remind people it's not common sense. There is a literature and there is a research base upon which you should be making these decisions. And so I think that continues to be some of the role of the office as we move forward. And the other's been about the pandemic. And I will say that leadership at the NIH when it came to the pandemic was really good very early this time about there is a social and behavioral component to this, right? Mitigation behaviors are behaviors. They occur in a social context. I mean, I don't need to tell the anthropologists of the world that, facial adornments mean something, right? And so face masks are something more than just something you put on your face. And so, all that stuff needed to be incorporated. And I feel like the leadership at the NIH has gotten a little bit more involved in that over the years, and that's been improving. But you're absolutely right. We need to keep that going and keep pushing, especially around project officers. And really, we have good. I'm rattling on here for a while on your answer to your question. We have really good project officers in the social and behavioral sciences at the NIH. The interaction between them and some of the biomedical researchers, I think that's the place where project officers, where we need to increase that connection a little bit more. So, yeah.
You're very helpful. There's one other question I received in the chat from a third year MA PhD sociology student who studies gender-based violence and has been looking at the impact of social isolation on victims of domestic violence, especially pandemic lockdown, decrease in shelter beds, and so on. And so curious, what would the T32 type prospects be for someone in such a position as this, especially with possible changes coming to T32s?
Yeah, so first, just a quick, so the T awards are to institutions, not to individuals, right? Where the Fs and the Ks are to individuals. And so there are people in that area of research where, I would say, given that stage of work, that maybe looking at a K award makes perfect sense. And it is also very consistent with the type of research that we're actually trying to encourage right now, right? We have a lot of research going on in violence, a lot of research having to do with the impacts of the pandemic and ways to sort of do that. So, and I will mention, for what it's worth, I know this is a different era, I never had a T, or I never was participated in a T. I never had an F. I never had a K. I just had an R, right? So, you can just sort of jump in. So I think some people believe you got to go through this process of all these little training steps to get to that point, and it's not necessary. But clearly, really good areas that are very consistent with some of the more pressing needs of the NIH right now. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so we're coming up against our time. Before I let you go, Bill, though, I just wanted to also express our thanks on behalf of the COSSA team, our entire community. We here you see Bill receiving the COSSA Distinguished Service Award a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic, really. And I wish there was a Please Don't Go award that we could give you, but at any rate, good luck, and we hope that we can express our thanks and gratitude in person at some point in the near future, but you will be terribly, terribly missed by this community.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right, gang, we're coming up to the end here, but as promised, I like to end with a couple of reminders of things you can do this month. We have our typical action alert still up for fiscal year 22 funding. And since that hasn't been resolved yet, if you haven't sent off your letters to your members of Congress asking them to support social behavioral science research funding at NIH, as well as other places, please go ahead and do that in our Action Center on our website. And then, as I noted earlier, there's 3 in particular very important nomination opportunities out there with deadlines coming up in the next week or 2. So I hope that you will consider these either for yourself or for someone that you know. And just a note that our November headlines is a week later than it normally would be. So mark your calendars for November 18th. We do have a speaker. We will likely be hearing from someone from the William T. Grant Foundation who has a specific funding solicitation that they're interested in promoting. So I hope you'll stay tuned and come back to hear all about that. And with that, I will thank you all for being with us this afternoon. I hope you'll come back, spread the word, and have a great day. Take care.